Land development projects have a life cycle, right? Just like caterpillars and butterflies, right? So they go through different stages, and the life cycle of a typical land development project starts with site selection and some conceptual design, right? Some design sketches, and then it usually ends with completed construction and the start of operations or start of occupancy. And so effective land development includes managing that life cycle, right? So if you're a land developer or project manager that works for land developers, part of being good at your job is understanding that that life cycle exists and being able to manage it, right? Manage the phases of that. So there's some built-in tension between when a developer wants to meet the requirements imposed by the local land use regulator and when the land use regulator wants those conditions to be met. Right, and so as a general rule, the land use regulator wants the conditions met earlier, and the developer wants the conditions met later, right? And some people will say, well, that's just because developers are greedy or because land use regulators are evil, and neither one of those things is true as a general rule. There's some very logical reasons why each side of that negotiating table wants to do the opposite in this situation, and so what I want to do in this video is explain why. Why does that tension exist? Kind of that push-pull. And then how can you just use some logic and common sense to negotiate when conditions of land development have to be met, right? Because you don't want it too early and you don't want it too late. You know, you want it just right. And so you got to be able to understand the kind of the dynamics to be able to know when those conditions should be timed, right? Okay, so let's talk about the developer for a minute. The developer wants to spend money on the land development project with as much certainty as possible, right? So uncertainty for a developer creates risk, right? So the developer wants to only spend money on the land development as his or her certainty that the project is actually going to be built increases, right? And so as a consequence of that, the developer doesn't want to have to meet conditions that are imposed by the land use regulator until they absolutely have to, right? Because that almost always meeting those conditions costs money, almost always, right? So the developer's trying to delay that expense to as close as project completion as they can, right? And it's not because they're greedy, it's because that's how they manage risk, right? Land development is inherently risky, and a good land developer isn't going to want to spend more money than he has until he or she has to spend it. Right? That's just part of how they manage risk. Okay, so that's what's driving the land developer. Now, on the other side of the table, let's talk about the land use regulator. What's driving the land use regulator? Okay, the land use regulator doesn't want to be left holding the bag, right? And developers go bankrupt, they disappear, right? And so the land use regulator doesn't want to be stuck with half-finished projects or with people that have bought homes in a subdivision and now there's no way to take care of the roads and the sewer pipes and the water district. And I'm going to do another video. We have a great example of how this has happened on a local land development project here in the Central Valley, and the subdivision was partially built, and now there's people living in these homes, and the water district, they can't fund the water district, and the original developer's long gone. So if you listen to my videos, you might think I've got an axe to grind with land use regulators. That might be true, but in this case, I understand their point of view, right? Because developers go bankrupt and public agencies get left holding the bag, right? So that's what's driving the land use regulator on the government side typically. So they want the developer to meet conditions as early as possible because that prevents these situations where there's unfunded liabilities that the developer is going to leave either to the public, to the taxpayer, or to the unfortunate individuals that bought into the development early on in the process. Okay, so so that's the tension, right? Developers trying to push conditions back, the land use regulator is trying to pull conditions forward in the life cycle, and so you have this tension. So how can you resolve that tension? Well, I really think logic and common sense should help determine the timing. That's something that a good private land use planner can help with, right? You can hire a guy like me or a gal like me that understands both sides, the private side and the public side, and can sit down, right, with the two sides and help come up with conditions of approval and the timing of those conditions that make sense, right, for the public and the private side. Okay, so here's some questions that I like to ask when I think about what should the timing be of a condition on a land development project. So there's three. The first question is, when does the harm need to be prevented? So land development has externalities, what they call externalities in economics. There's potential harm. So when is that harm going to occur, right? And that is the most important of the three questions, right? You want to determine when can that harm occur, and then you want to make sure that the condition of the development that mitigates that harm is implemented immediately before that harm can occur, right? Not way before it occurs and not way after it occurs, but immediately before the potential harm, right? That's the right time. So that's the first question. Second question is, should the condition or mitigation be imposed during entitlement, design, pre-construction, construction, post-construction, during operation or occupancy? So remember, land development projects are like a caterpillar or a butterfly. There's different phases, right? And so part of being a good land developer and a good land use regulator is understanding those phases and knowing, all right, when is the appropriate phase to impose the condition? Now, this is especially important on the government side. And again, this is where I sympathize with the land use regulator on the government side. In California, we only give the government land use regulator a few points in the project life cycle in which they can impose conditions. And there's only 3 or 4, okay? So they only get so many bites at the apple, in other words, right? And so if they wait too long, they're gonna miss their opportunity, right, to impose conditions, and then harm could be imposed on the taxpayer, right, or the public. And so you have to understand when those trigger points are for the government agency as a developer, and you got to realize that they only get so many bites at the apple, and so you can't push the imposition of the development conditions beyond the trigger points, because then the government agency is going to be stuck, right? So you have to understand that. Okay, so the government agency only gets so many opportunities to impose conditions by law. You need to understand when those are, and then you have to think about what's the appropriate opportunity, right? There's only 3 or 4. That doesn't mean the government agency should be able to impose all the conditions at the first opportunity under the law, because that doesn't work either, okay? But you can't push all the conditions to the last opportunity either. There's a balance. Okay, the third question is, what is a consequence of imposing too early or too late? So you have to ask yourself, okay, if we impose this condition too early, what will the impact be? If we impose it too late, what will the impact be? Both sides should be asking that question. That helps them to be reasonable. Okay, so I want to give you some examples. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example these are all true stories, real life examples from my own practice. I'm going to give you an example of a land development condition that was imposed too early, one that was imposed at just the right time, and one that was imposed too late. Okay, so you can understand. Okay, so here's the one that was too early. I had a local city. We were trying to do a land subdivision, split one parcel into 2, and it was going to be for commercial development, and I was working on the subdivision map. So that's fairly early in the life cycle, right? So we're early on in the process, and the public agencies come back to me and they said, we need to do a geotechnical report. You have to go pay for a geotechnical report. You got to go drill a bunch of holes and tell us what kind of soil you have. Now, there's a good reason for the land use regulator to do that. They want to know that buildings aren't going to fall down, right? They want to know that you're building on stable soil. There's a public health and safety issue there. I didn't have a problem with that. Here's why the condition was too early. We didn't know where we were going to put the buildings. We didn't even know if my client was going to build the buildings. He was just trying to subdivide. It could be that he would subdivide, somebody else would come in and buy that lot and put a building on it, right? These were commercial lots. They were already zoned commercial, okay? So I didn't want to have to go drill holes all over, it was like 8 acres. I didn't want to drill holes all over 8 acres. It's really expensive to drill holes for geotechnical study, right? We wanted to drill the holes after we knew where the buildings were going to go, right? We wanted to limit the scope of the drilling because it was going to save a lot of money. So that was an example of where a public agency was trying to impose a condition too early, right? And we were able to work with the city, and we got them to push that back. Okay, so here's an example of a land development condition imposed at just the right time. So we've got another project we're working on, rural subdivision. We're working on this right now. We talked to the county about, hey, when are you going to make the developer demonstrate that there's water? In other words, when does he have to go drill wells? And the county said, we're not going to make you do that for the subdivision approval, but before you can pull a building permit to put homes on any of the lots, you got to be able to come in and demonstrate to us that you have water. Okay? Perfect. That's the right time, right? When is the harm going to be done? They don't want somebody building a house and not being able to have water, so they condition the issuance of the building permit on the existence of a well with sufficient water, right? Good timing, right? By the way, that was Tuolumne County in Central California. Good job, Tuolumne County. All right, here's an example of a condition that's imposed too late. I get this call once or twice a month. There's a building inspector on a construction site. They're getting ready to pour concrete for the foundation of the building, and the inspector wants to have the building setback verified because he's worried the building is too close to the property line. We find out there wasn't a survey done. Now there's a big chocolate mess. That is an example of the public agency waiting too long to impose the condition. You don't want to wait till you're in construction and the concrete trucks are there to make sure that the building is in the right spot. They need to have that verified when the civil engineering and architectural plans are approved, right? So that in that case, they waited too long, right? Now there's going to be extra cost and expense because they waited too long to impose the condition. So those are 3 examples. Just remember now, if you impose too early, if you impose your land development conditions too early, that raises the cost of development in your community. You're going to stifle development, right? You're not going to have as much development, which can have consequences for the economic health of your community over the long run. If you impose too late, you're going to cause unnecessary harm, right? The taxpayer and the public is going to be harmed because you're not making the developer mitigate the potential harm that their project is going to cause. It's a difficult balance to achieve, right? I'm not saying it's easy. There's some tension there, but logic and common sense can help. Don't forget those 3 questions, right? You want to ask, just to review. Let's go through them real quick. The 3 questions: when does the harm need to be prevented? What phase of the project should the condition be imposed in? And what is the consequence of imposing either too early or too late? You should ask that for each condition. If you need to, hire the help of a private land planner like me to negotiate the timing of those conditions with the public agency that's regulating your land development.